So Roberto Gerard has been the object of a notable rise in attention over the past few decades. The founding of the Spain-based instrumental ensemble Proyecto Gerard in 1996 brought to the attention of Spanish audiences a composer up to then largely unknown in his own country. Beginning in the 2000s, a few research projects and conferences have brought international recognition to Gerard's music, culminating in the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of his death in 2020, which this conference commemorates. Parallel to these developments, the Generalitat Catalana has promoted his work through a range of initiatives, notably the creation of the Robert Gerard Center for the Promotion and Diffusion of Catalan Musical Heritage in 2008. In the 30 years since Gerard was rescued from the verge of oblivion, he has come to be predominantly regarded as one of Spain's most important composers and a valuable cultural asset. Why a re-evaluation of his figure has not happened before is due in part to political circumstances. Discussion of the horrors of the Francoist past continues to create divisions in Spanish politics and society, as shown by Sebastian Faber, among other scholars. A prominent side in these debates that aims to turn the page and forget that the dictatorship ever happened has triggered a backlash from several corners of the academic world. Beginning with Joan Ramon Resina, several scholars have characterized the lack of debate about the civil war and Francoism during the transition to democracy as an exercise in collective amnesia and the outcome of a pacto del olvido, or agreement to forget, a view that has earned some criticism. Spain feels readier to confront its difficult past nowadays than in the wake of the Franco dictatorship. Yet the recent re-evaluation of Gerard's music has missed a valuable opportunity to engage in the memory debates of contemporary Spain because it has mainly focused on formalistic aspects in an attempt to promote Gerard as an exponent of the international music avant-garde. So looking at the program of this conference, you begin to sense that things have changed or are beginning to change notably. Significantly less attention has been paid to the political subtext of his music, particularly Gerard's references to folklore, icons, and myths from Spain and Catalonia in his works. The focus on Gerard's abstract modernism, dominant in journalism, scholarship, criticism, and concert programming, is driven in part by Spain's marked tendency to market its cultural exports as standard bearers of internationalism. Promoters of this identity brand are usually eager to see Spain emerge victorious from its endless struggle to shake off the perennial Black legend, that is, the legacies of Orientalism that have earned this country its stigmatizing place of honor in the history of European exoticism. In order to redress this tendency, this paper studies Gerard's cultural responses to exile, assessing the extent to which the identity questions raised by his music and writings help him find orientation amid the cultural struggles of Francoist Spain and Cold War Britain. My discussion builds on critical surveys of representations of Catalan and Spanish traditions in Gerard music by Julian White, Mark Perry, and other scholars, and analyzes the testimonies of music critics in his time. In studying the political and cultural subtexts in Gerard's music, I aim in part to make up for the comparatively larger attention devoted to the formal and innovative aspects of his music, including his pioneering use of electronic composition. The study of form, although necessary, raises a few questions about the way Gerard's modernism could be interpreted other than through enduring Eurocentric narratives that situate Spain and its music at the peripheries of modernity, or even fully outside. These questions gain particular relevance when an urge to re-evaluate the culture of refugees, and the music of Gerard in particular, has been identified. One may therefore ask, in what ways could the study of national icons and myths in the work of exiles give insights into the complex relationship between the nation and modernism? Should avant-garde aesthetics and the use of national traditions be regarded as opposite poles, or can they be considered two interdependent and intimately related sides of musical modernism? In order to make sense of Gerard's modernism, I argue, it is necessary to account for the way he developed creative responses to exile through a range of aesthetic formulations that included, but were not limited to, abstract modernism. Some of Girard's most compelling and sophisticated responses to forced displacement and Franco's centralist cultural politics can be found in his music's readings of icons and myths such as flamenco, Don Quixote, Catalan folklore, and Spanish music history. These facets of Girard's output reveal some of the complex ways in which Spain and Catalonia function as multi-layered archives of memory in the work of exiles. This task is not without complexities. The cultural study of Girard's music must confront the dilemmas faced by exile studies. The exceptional position of exile culture relative to the canon sets specific demands on the scholar that could lend the culture of exiles a somewhat stigmatizing aura of alterity. To conceive of exile culture as a counter-canon may reinforce its interest as a subject of study, but it could lead scholars to neglect the extent to which it has contributed to major cultural projects, most notably the making of the nation. In the cogent analysis of the literature and culture of Spanish Republican exiles presented by Maripaz Valibrea in Tiempo de Exilio, the nation is indeed a powerful construct that mediates between exile's cultural singularity and its symbolic centrality. Valibrea argues that the status of Republican exile in Spain is paradoxical because it is simultaneously central and residual to the dominant narratives of Spanish history. The absence signified by exile, she argues, is structurally indispensable to understanding both the Franco dictatorship and the democracy that followed it. And yet, that absence is the result of exclusion, because exile does not fit in the lineal temporality of the narrative dominant in Spanish history, formed by the Second Republic, the Civil War, the dictatorship, and the transition to democracy. Studying exile is, therefore, a way to enrich our understanding of Spanish modernity in the 20th century. And yet, because exile culture has been excluded from the time of the nation, Valibrea considers it necessary to maintain a dichotomy between exile and nation in her analysis. Maintaining this dichotomy helps to protect the singularity of exile culture and promote its potential to critique the dominant imperial narratives of Spanish history and identity. But what then to make of some exiles' conscious and willing decision to engage in the making of the nation? The persistence with which the Don Quixote theme features in the literature of exiles is evidence, in Arredondo's view, of their desire to construct a national counter-tradition, expressed through their alternative readings of one of Spain's most salient and representative symbols. These counter-readings, even if they could be regarded as constituents of a counter-nation, do not necessarily stand outside of the nation, but remain critically within it. Maintaining a dichotomy between exile and the nation may thus call attention to those aspects of the culture of exiles that hold loose or no links to nationalism. This selective focus, however, will be mainly at the expense of missing out on the exile's attempts to critique the nation from within. To the extent that exile may illustrate the proposition by Stalibras and White that so often what is socially peripheral is symbolically central, then should exile not be considered part of modernity's central identity project, namely a nation? Rather than relegate the culture of exiles to a space outside of the nation, or to conceive of it as a coming to terms with what one could call the impossibility of the Spanish nation, to paraphrase Sebastian Faber, one could place exile at the nation's margins, a position from which it destabilizes canonic nationalist narratives without fully turning its back on them. My reading of Girard's use of national icons and myths is therefore an attempt to account for the ways in which exile culture intersects with and even becomes intimate with some forms of control and resistance, violence and reconciliation, division and consensus that have been deployed or expressed in the name of the nation. This paper thus argues that Girard's music aimed to destabilize the monologic idea of the nation imposed by the Franco regime. The forms of heteroglossia articulated in Girard's music, continuing with Bakhtin's terminology, destabilize the centripetal force of the lineal temporality of the Francoist nation that is the target of Valibrea's critique. This journey will lead to fascinating discoveries, but unpleasant ones too. Gerard's music and the meanings it produced are further proof that the dividing lines between the Francoist nation and the nation of exiles are not as clear-cut as it tends to be argued. As shown by Sebastian Faber, the exiles' attempts to lay claim to Spain's tradition of conservative liberalism in the name of the Republic clashed with similar attempts by the Franco regime. The ironies arising from the uncomfortable intertwining of these two Spains look deeper when examined in the context of Cold War Britain, where Gerard's use of Catalan and Spanish symbols was read against a set of concerns remote to his own. British commissioners, critics and audiences paid no heed to Gerard's attempts to undermine some of the pillars of Franco's cultural nationalist project. They were simply not familiar enough with the specific connotations that Spanish and Catalan cultural symbols that Gerard played with. Why should they be? The cultural struggles that British critics were enmeshed in prompted them to fit the music of Gerard and other exiles into cultural and racial categories that they felt comfortable navigating, but that did not have an equivalent in Spain. Gerard was thus a victim of the highly strained and divisive cultural politics of the Cold War, which cast a negative view on the use of folklore in modern composition. His music was judged from the perspective of a Eurocentric notion of musical modernism that set his Spanish and Catalan background, the difference mattered only to a few critics, against the long trajectory of orientalizing Spain in European culture. Further, Gerard was a victim of the rise of anti-German and anti-Semitic sentiment in Britain, which beginning in the 1930s nurtured negative views of 12-tone technique and raised suspicions about the music of Schoenberg and his former pupils, one of whom was Gerard. The various challenges faced by Gerard during his career in Britain put this project in jeopardy. So I will be discussing today the first two challenges that you have on the screen. I won't have time to discuss the third one, which I will leave for a future occasion should it happen. So while political reasons lie behind the recent interest in re-evaluating Gerard's music, factors of a different kind explain why he started to earn recognition only towards the end of his career. Notably the cultural struggles of Cold War Britain and related to them, the dominance of the absolute music paradigm. Up until at least the 1920s, Spanish composers were known abroad for using folklore in composition. Composers from Europe's cultural margins who wished to succeed in Europe's hubs, notably Paris and London, were expected to foreground in their music the markers of identity that could be easily identified by the audiences of those cities. This technique allowed audiences to map musical traditions onto a cartography of musical styles that was organized around the idea of nation, and to match the different countries and their composers to one another. Being able to identify a composer's country of origin was the first step for audiences and critics to develop a musical taste and to translate music's abstract emotions into the more familiar language of national stereotypes. This way of writing music and the craving for national stereotypes that supported it started to wane around the time of the First World War. In Manuel de Falla's works from the 1920s, such as El Retablo de Maese Pedro or his harpsichord concerto, folk song gave way to the use of melodies drawn from early modern songbooks, in a way similar to how Debussy and Ravel turned their attention to the French Baroque around that time. The use of folklore or references to the musical history of the nation, whether evocative, such as in Ravel's Les Tombeaux de Couperin, or literal, did not altogether die with the Cold War, and continued to be somewhat popular among ballet fans, but became unfashionable among the avant-garde circles. The post-Second World War avant-garde embraced ideals of abstract, absolute international music, even more determinant than fashion in phasing out the use of folklore in composition was the radical extent to which its connotations changed in the Cold War context. The Western Bloc started to regard with suspicion the use of folk song in composition in response to the Eastern Bloc's adoption of popular culture as an emblem of class struggle. In Britain, although the dividing lines between pro-Western and pro-Eastern musical aesthetics was somewhat blurry, the radical confrontation between these two aesthetic worlds could nevertheless have a devastating impact on the lives of musicians as shown by Joanna Bullivant. A composer of communist sympathies, such as Alan Bush, suffered discrimination, having his music banned by the BBC during the Second World War. Although initially adamant about folk songs' romantic and bourgeois connotations, Bush ended up regarding it as the music of the working classes in the 1940s. Thus, in his Symphony in C, Bush used folk song in combination with 12-tone technique, as did Gerard in many of his works. If ever there was a composer whose career exposed the contradictions and complexities of Cold War aesthetics, that was the Hungarian Bela Bartok. Bartok was caught up in between the musical fronts of the Western and the Eastern blocs, both of which vindicated his work as emblematic of their respective musical aesthetics, as shown by Daniel Fosler-Lussier. Bartok's combination of avant-garde techniques with folklore was attractive to Gerard. The latter praised the marvelous process of transubstantiation through which Bartok's music absorbs the folk culture of his home country. In Gerard's opinion, this is the most significant lesson that Catalan musicians should extrapolate from this Hungarian master. Yet, despite Gerard's admiration for Bartok, their treatment of folklore differed somewhat. Bartok subjected folk song to a process of radical stylization, refraining from harmonizing the melody and creating with it complex contrapuntal textures. Nowhere in Bartok's music is the folkloric exuberance that characterizes the opening of Gerard's Alegrias to be found. One cannot but agree with Michael Ross's view that the identity of borrowed materials seems significant to Gerard, and its absorption into compositional language is much less evident than in Bartok. This difference was detrimental to Gerard because it biased critics' adamant of folk song against his music. Gerard was caught up in the middle of these cultural wars. Success came to him right around the time that he stopped using folklore in composition. Up until the 1950s, his music made regular use of folklore from different regions of Spain, most notably Catalonia. Following his arrival in Cambridge in 1939, Gerard started to receive commissions from ballet and theatre companies and film producers. Many of these works made use of folk song in more or less explicit ways. They were not performed at Britain's greatest concert halls, either because they belonged to genres predominantly considered secondary, because they were composed for ends other than attentive listening at the concert hall, because they made use of folklore somewhat conspicuously, or because some of them were unfashionably linked to Spain by theme, as was the case of the ballets Flamenco and Don Quixote. There may not be a direct or straightforward correlation between these different factors, as is suggested by the fact that Gerard used folklore in his radio music or his theatre scores for the Royal Shakespeare Company, even though he was not required or expected to do so. All these different factors, however, jointly contributed to cornering Gerard's music into a space outside of the elite avant-garde circuits, which preferred abstract, absolute, non-functional music. The music of Gerard's last decade did conform to this aesthetic ideal, and was indeed regularly performed at the Royal Festival Hall and the Proms, among other prestigious venues. But until he was discovered in the late 1950s, Gerard, like most other refugees, had survived composing functional music that ran counter to the principle of aesthetic autonomy embraced by the mainstream avant-garde. Refugees were thus trapped in a vicious circle. They were expected to produce work that classed them in a particular type of composer from which it was difficult to progress toward a more successful career. I interpret Gerard's decision to use folklore in his functional incidental music as evidence that he did not approach his commissions as mere sources of income, but rather conceived of them as a critical space in which he could articulate complex readings of Spanish and Catalan icons, symbols, and myths. Until at least the end of Gerard's career, however, critics continued to dismiss his earlier works as non-artistic, functional music that had diverted him from the true path towards success, which in their view was abstract, absolute music. They were not aware that it was precisely this kind of stigmatizing prejudice that had set so many obstacles in Gerard's career up to the 1960s. An homage paid to him by the London Sinfonietta 3 years after he died reveals very clearly how enduring this mindset was. The program clearly favored his abstract non-functional works, with the exception of Sardana No. 1 and the ballet Pandora. The lavish booklet produced for the occasion followed the same orientation. In his contribution to the booklet, music producer and at the time member of the BBC division of music, Ates Orga, referred to Gerard's arrangement and orchestration of popular Spanish songs and instrumental pieces as breadline commissions. According to Orga, these works form a set apart from Gerard's most important abstract compositions, which date mainly from the 1960s. Orga's testimony was not isolated. The Times obituary declared that Gerard's aim as a composer had always been to establish an abstract, non-Spanish musical language of his own. Yet Gerard never stated this to be the case. It never occurred to these critics that Gerard used incidental music to address some of the questions of identity that really mattered to him, and that it was precisely this type of works in which he experimented with novel techniques, such as electronic music. The ideal of abstract, absolute music continued to dominate in interpretations of Gerard's career for decades. In 1985, Richard Morrison of The Times interpreted the presence of Catalan folklore in Gerard's orchestral piece, Albada Interludi y Danza, as a manifestation of a political inclination that distracted Gerard from his usual musical inclination to write atonal or serial music. A generalized unawareness of the kinds of prejudices that had slowed down Gerard's career got mixed up somewhat oddly in the writings of critics with views that his work had been the victim of unjust neglect until the late 1950s. A 1958 review of his violin concerto, tellingly titled A Neglected Composer, argued that Gerard's work was comparatively neglected in Britain. A year later, Peter Hayworth of The Observer claimed that in the 20 years that Roberto Gerard has lived in this country, his music has suffered a neglect that is hard to justify. In 1969, The Times published a laudatory article in which William Mann declared, "Now that Roberto Gerard is in his 70s, this country, where he has made his home for 30 years, is beginning to show some gratitude for his presence among us." Gerard died a year after. In showing these testimonies, I do not intend to vindicate Gerard's music or restore it to a position that it may deserve. I merely aim to reconcile claims that Gerard's music had been neglected with testimonies arguing that he got distracted on his path towards success by composing political works and purely functional music, supposedly contrary to his own interests. This contradiction arguably arose from the clash between two fundamentally different conceptions of musical modernism, one aligned with the aesthetics of absolute music, and one that did not consider folk song inimical to modern composition. One must also consider the impact of Eurocentric views on perceptions of the use of folklore in composition prior to the Cold War. Whereas the presence of folklore in the work of Beethoven has never questioned his status as a universal composer, universal and German at the same time, supposedly, the stylized references to flamenco in Falla's music reinforce perceptions that Spain is a peripheral culture, and consequently assigned to Falla a marginal position in the Western canon. While the Cold War created an environment hostile to the use of folklore in composition, Eurocentric and Orientalist traditions of thought weighed upon the critics' judgment and clouded their ability to engage with Gerard's music in ways sympathetic to his agenda. In particular, the legacies of the centuries of exoticizing Spain in European culture raised a relatively narrow range of expectations about the music of a composer tagged as Spanish, prompting critics to search for markers of nationality in the music of Gerard. This approach made critics miss out on important dimensions of Gerard's work, such as his critical reading of Spanish and Catalan traditions. It also made them feel disoriented whenever those markers were not present in Gerard's music, prompting them to interpret Gerard's abstract music as the expression of a cultural periphery. Last, the legacies of Spanish exoticism left no room for Catalonia in the European imagination, and consequently, did not establish any points of reference from which Gerard's use of Catalan folklore could be interpreted meaningfully. The history of Gerard's ballet Flamenco, which premiered in 1943, is illustrative of some of these cultural ironies. The only requirement of the ballet Rambert, which commissioned Gerard's score, was that the music should be in the flamenco style. The scenario, created by Gerard, mocked the Carmen story made famous by Bizet's opera, replacing Carmen's suitors, the soldier José and the bullfighter Escamilla, with a harassing, booing impresario. Carmencita, Gerard's version of Carmen, rejects outright the advances of the impresario, who gets punished for intruding in her life by being given a mock kill and a mock funeral during the main dance, so obviously reminiscent of the finale in Falla's The Three-Cornered Hat. Flamenco had a short run, and like most ballets, is better known today as an orchestral suite, which Gerard titled Alegrías. Audiences most surely enjoyed Alegrías as a celebration of exuberant and exotic Spanishness, because the elements of parody that were present in flamenco were inevitably lost as the fully staged ballet was transformed into a purely orchestral score. Audiences not familiar with the original ballet could not have known that Gerard's mockery of a well-known French take on Spanish traditions, that is Carmen, reflected to some extent his ambivalent stance on flamenco, which he expressed years later in a BBC radio talk titled Primitive Folk Music from Spain. And except from this talk places flamenco/alegrías in a very different light. Flamenco put the other peninsular repertoires on the shade, and thus in fact steal the show. The point is that, to a large extent, flamenco is show business, partly folk culture, partly show business, not unlike that other hybrid, the bullfight, with which it competes in the field of tourist attraction. It seems impossible not to read these words as a critique of Franco's appropriation and exploitation of flamenco to centralize Spain and boost tourism-related revenues. As is well known, Franco carried out a crusade against Basque, Catalan, and Andalusian nationalisms, blaming them for tearing apart Spain's social fabric and political unity. In Catalonia, he banned the use of Catalan language, the flag, and cultural icons such as the sardana. In Andalusia, he broke all ties between flamenco and the region's claims for autonomy, turning this music into a Spanish national icon. Several scholars have used the expression nacional flamenquismo to refer to Franco's use of flamenco to centralize Spain. This cultural policy also had important economic advantages. Franco placed flamenco at the center of a cultural project that blended traditionalist and kitsch icons such as gypsies, bullfighting, and religious Easter processions, with the aim of attracting tourists in search for cultural difference, under the motto, Spain is different, something that Matthew Perry has also discussed in his paper. This policy led to the fastest economic growth in the recent history of Spain. Gerard's opposition to Franco's use of flamenco surely went unnoticed by the earliest audiences of his ballet flamenco in Britain. His views on Catalan identity and folklore were more complex and more likely to be overlooked or suffer misunderstanding. Before he exiled, Gerard composed a few Catalan works, such as the song cycle L'Infante Mà Meravellós de Xerezada, the Cantata l'Alta Naixença del Rei en Jaume, the two sardanas, the 14 cançons populars catalanes, the orchestral piece Albada Interludi i Dansa, and the unfinished Ballet Soirée de Barcelone, to name a few. He also published editions of the work of Catalan composers, such as Domènec Terradellas, Antoni Soler, and Josep Pla, and had actively promoted the work of contemporary Catalan composers. Further, he expressed support for Catalan nationalism during the Second Republic. According to Leticia Sánchez de Andrés, Gerard was closer to supporting the independence of Catalonia than his brother Carles, who was a member of the Catalan parliament for the Unió Socialista de Catalunya in the early 1930s. Gerard's stance towards Catalan nationalism arguably became more moderate during exile, as is shown by his contribution to a collaborative book by exiled Catalans titled El Libro Blanco de Catalunya, written in protest against the decision by the United Nations to accept Franco's Spain as a full member in 1955. Catalonia, as it slowly begins to be known, is Spain with a difference, indeed with a great many differences. The central spark of Hispanic incandescence is there, but surrounded by a field of softer luminosity, greatly contrasting with the typical Spanish glare. For the mind that lives in such a temperate climate, the qualities of poise and balance, the exquisite sensibility to the values of proportion and to the language of form are of overriding importance. This temperateness and equability of mind are best summarized by a Catalan word that, significantly enough, has no equivalent in Castilian or Spanish language. It is the word senya. These words reveal Gerard's proximity to the thinking of Noucentisme, a Catalan nationalist, non-secessionist artistic and literary movement of the 1920s. Noucentisme's leader, the fascist-leaning Eugeni d'Ors, constructed Catalan identity as a balance resulting from two contrasting ideas: senya, meaning refined, pondered wisdom, and rauxa, connoting action and determination. Noucentisme advocated for the expansion of Catalan culture across all Latin nations on the basis of its claim that Catalonia was heir to the wisdom of Greek and Latin antiquity. Noucentisme did not pursue the independence of Catalonia, however, and the fact that Gerard defined this region as Spain with a difference further suggests that he could have felt ideologically close to this movement. Gerard came to develop views on Catalan nationalism similar to those of Granados, Albéniz, and his former master Pedrell. According to Moreda Rodríguez, none of these composers, including Gerard, perceived their dual Catalan and Spanish identities as mutually exclusive. Not only Gerard's views on Catalan nationalism changed after exile, but the way he used markers of Catalan identity in his music did too. The explicit reference to myths and icons of Catalonia, such as King Jaume I, the Sardana, or the city of Barcelona in the title of his earlier works, is nowhere in his post-1939 catalogue. Gerard did not receive commissions to write Catalan works analogous to his Spanish ballets Flamenco and Don Quixote, probably because, unlike Spain, Catalonia did not have a place of its own in the exotic imagination of Europeans. As Julian White has remarkably shown, Gerard continued to use folk songs from the different Catalan-speaking regions, Valencia, Majorca, and Catalonia, while in exile nevertheless, though in works with no apparent links to Catalan culture, such as his ballet Pandora, his piano and violin concertos, the Symphony No. 4, the Cantata de Plague, his incidental music for Shakespeare plays, and even in works with a Spanish theme, such as his ballet Don Quixote. Some of these quotations arguably had political and autobiographical meanings. For example, a few of his works, including The Plague and Pandora, quote the Catalan patriotic song L'Emigrant, based on a poem by Jacint Verdaguer about an emigrant who misses Catalonia. The fact that Gerard's references to Catalan nationalism in exile were somewhat cryptic was most likely a consequence of the fact that he did not have an audience that would resonate with them. It is significant that he continued to use Catalan folklore regularly in his works nevertheless. With a few notable exceptions, the majority of British critics consider Gerard a Spanish composer, even when reviewing works with no references to Spain in either the title or the score, such as those of his last decade. A review by Paul Griffiths of Gerard's studies for instrumental ensemble Leo and Libra found that the Leo blaze and boldness of his native Spain is set in contrast with Libra's compromise, that quality which, true to the cliché, seems so much a British characteristic in the works of the young composers. In his review, Griffiths dwelt on a long-standing Orientalist tradition of representing Spain through tropes of excess, making this country look uncivilized. Britain is contrastingly defining this tradition as the epitome of measure and self-restraint. Desmond Shaw Taylor played with similarly contrasting national stereotypes. In his opinion, Gerard's instrumental style of the 1960s though never willful or awkward, makes formidable demands. It breathes the dry Spanish air and asks for an electric sparkle and precision. Neither of these two critics intended to cast Gerard in the image of a noble savage, but rather aimed to render complexity through the simplifying lens of national stereotypes. In that way, they tried to make up for the fact that they did not know how to navigate the music of a Spanish composer in the absence of markers of national identity. These different symptoms of disorientation show that the Orientalist legacies of Spanish exoticism in European culture raised a very specific set of expectations with regards to the music of a composer tagged as Spanish, and thus impaired the critic's ability to engage with Gerard's music in ways sympathetic to his agenda. As shown by the study of the ballet flamenco, nationality was the foremost determinant in shaping critical responses to the work of non-British composers. The ballet Rambert were eager to exploit Gerard's background as a source of consumer exoticism, but the type of musical product he was asked to compose ran counter to his critical stance in certain Spanish traditions, particularly flamenco. Second, the insignificant position of Catalonia in the European imagination compared to the overwhelming presence of Spain forced Gerard to bury his engagement with icons and myths of Catalonia under the surface of works that the mainstream media dismissed as functional music with little or no artistic worth. In other words, although exoticism assigned a relatively defined place to a foreign culture such as Spain in the European imagination, it also elicited automatic cultural responses from the public. Exotic stereotypes create habits in audiences and critics, such that in the absence of exotic markers of identity, exiles feel forced to adopt somewhat extreme cultural strategies to avoid giving up on their identity projects. Last, the inertial responses shaped during the heyday of exoticism prompted critics to search for markers of nationality in the music of composers from countries deemed culturally peripheral, such as Spain. These interferences again clouded the critics' ability to engage with Gerard's music in more substantial and less predictable ways. Ironically, stereotypes supplanted the critical readings of national icons and myths articulated by Gerard with a timeless rendition of Spain and Catalonia, akin to the one promoted by the Franco regime in pursuit of political and economic gain. After all, Franco geared his refashioning of flamenco to the taste of foreign tourists, the bulk of whom came from Britain. Rather than lay blame on British critics for the lack of empathy with Gerard's agenda, I consider the extent to which their reactions could have led Gerard to develop new insights into the questions of identity that matter to him. Following Stokes, one could ask, what happens when the musical expectations of the host society problematize for the visitors some hitherto invisible aspects of the visitor's musical habitus? To answer this question, I regard the cultural ironies discussed within a broader analytical lens that brings into focus the resignification undergone by cultural science and markers of identity transnationally. Scholar of exile Lisa Malki has theorized this process with particular reference to the situation of exiles, showing that the specific historical local politics of particular refugees retreat to a depoliticizing, dehistoricizing register of a more abstract and universal suffering in that context. From this perspective, the misreading of Gerard's use of cultural symbols by British critics could be interpreted not only or not so much as the product of a conflict of cultural and linguistic codes, but more broadly as a conflict arising from the encounter between two asynchronous temporalities, those of home and the host culture. This conflict of temporalities characterizes the nation of exiles and differentiates it from the idea of the nation prevalent in the home country and the host culture. Modernity, whether an aspiration of the Francoist state or the path towards a certain aesthetic ideal, aims to cancel or deny any such conflict and aspires to subsume any particular configuration of temporal experience within the homogenizing time of the present. My analysis has thus attempted to uncover what, paraphrasing Hutchings, could be described as a heterotemporality, in which there is a mutual contamination of nows that do not derive their significance from one meta-narrative, whether that meta-narrative is the Francoist nation or Eurocentric musical modernism. It may thus be possible to argue that the ballet flamenco is neither a critique of Franco's appropriation of flamenco, as Gerard might have intended, nor a celebration of Spanish exoticism, as his commissioners and audiences might have wanted. Rather, this ballet gathered its strength precisely from its capacity to speak to highly differing concerns and desires, and from inhabiting an in-betweenness that exposed the contradictions of both the Francoist nation and the musical aesthetics of Cold War Britain. The same could be said about the other facets of his compositional output, in which a conflict between Gerard's apparent intentions and the expectations of his audiences became most dramatically evident, such as the works in which he used Catalan folklore covertly, or his abstract music. Gerard's struggle to make sense of these conflicting temporalities therefore calls for the use of the concept of chronotope, which Bakhtin defined as the intrinsic connectedness of temporal and spatial relationships. Exiles cannot make meaning of their present and past experiences without attaining that connectedness. According to Sarah Daines, for exiles, history is no longer a continuous flow expressed by an uninterrupted transmission, but it becomes a time broken into before and after. Unfamiliar places in which history is spontaneously rooted are not inhabited day after day, but are replaced by an imaginary elsewhere that dwells in memory. Gerard's attempts to attain this connectedness through transcultural engagement, rather than self-fulfilling nostalgia, could arguably be considered the expression and materialization of a chronotope of exile. This conflicted chronotope disrupts the monology of the Franco state and destabilizes narratives of modernism predicated on the aesthetics of abstract music. Yet, as long as we continue to regard Gerard as either an initially failed but gradually accomplished aspirant to international abstract modernism, or insisting focusing only or mainly on those works that cast him in that image, we will miss out on the potentialities of his critical readings of Spanish and Catalan myths and icons. Thank you very much for your attention.